Alright folks, so in our last video we talked about how to determine the secondary and subsecondary in the Henry classification. And in this video we're going to talk about the final three pieces of the Henry classification, which are the major, the key, and the final. So let's talk about the major. Alright, the major in our Henry classification is going to go just to the left of the primary. So we've already talked about how to do a primary, we've talked about how to do a secondary and subsecondary. Next we're going to talk about the major. And the major is going to be written here just to the left of the primary. And the major, you can see, is it has both a numerator and denominator, and it's going to be one single letter in either in both the numerator and the denominator. So what is the major? Well, the major really deals with only two fingers. It deals with the two thumbs. The major deals with finger number 1, which is the right thumb, and finger number 6, which is the left thumb. The major is really only concerned with loops or whirls. If we have a small letter, so if we have one of our thumbs, if it happens to be a plain arch, a tenon arch, or a radial loop, then we actually don't have a major at all. So we're only looking to see if there are loops and whirls in our thumbs. When we do our annotation for the major, we're either going to write a capital S, a capital M, a capital L if it's a loop, or if they're whirls, we're going to put an I, an M, or an O. If the fingerprint in the thumbs is a whirl, then all we're going to do is write the tracing, either an I, an M, or an O. If the fingerprint in the thumb is a loop, then we're going to go back to our cheat sheet, and I'll tell you where to go look for that. So looking at this fingerprint card that's already been blocked, looking at the Henry, again, here we have our primary, which deals with the whirls we have and where they're located. So just to the left of the primary we find our major. And again, our major is going to be either SML or an IMO. If we look at these two fingerprints, again, we're only looking at fingerprint number 1, which is the right thumb, and finger number 6, which is the left thumb. If those fingerprints are whirls, all we need to do then is simply move the tracing up. So for example, I can move the O up here to the numerator, and then the finger number 6, the tracing goes in the denominator, so we'd move the I down here to the denominator. So that was pretty easy. Alright, what if the fingerprints, though, are loops? Alright, well, so let's look at the two thumbs. One of them is a whirl. We can see that the finger number 6 is a whirl, so again, all we're going to do is pull the tracing up so we can pull our I up here to our denominator. But when we look at our right thumb, finger number 1, we can see that it's a loop. So how do we know whether it's going to be an S, an M, or an L? And to do that, what we need to do is we need to go back to our cheat sheet. And if you look at your cheat sheet, if you pull it up, if we look in the box for finger number 1, you can see that there's some little notation that says if the ridge count of the loop is between 1 to 11, then we're going to put an S. If it's between 12 to 16, we're going to put an M. Or if it's 17 and over, we're going to put an L. So looking at the fingerprint here in finger number 1, we can see that the ridge count is 16. And so 16, we can see, looking at our cheat sheet, if the ridge count is between 12 and 16, we put an M. And so you can see for our major, we've written an M up here. So if it's a loop, use your cheat sheet. If it's a whirl, simply bring up the tracing. So the major is pretty easy. What about this fingerprint? Well, when we look at this set of fingerprints, we notice right away that one of the two fingerprints has a small letter. We can see that the left thumb is an arch. So whenever we have a small letter, an A for a plain arch or a T for a tenon arch, notice then here that there is no major. So we don't include a major if either one of the thumbs is a small letter, meaning it's a plain arch, a tenon arch, or a radial loop. So only ulnar loops or whirls are what's going to make up your major. All right, second to the last part of the Henry classification is what's called the key. And the key goes here on the left-hand side, and it's only going to be found in the numerator. It's going to be up to top. So you notice for the key there's only one number, and it is a number, not a letter. It's going to go here, and it's going to go in the numerator, and it's going to be on the left side of the major. So it only goes in the numerator, and it goes to the left of the major. The key is a number. Now the key is pretty easy. All we're going to do is we're going to look at our fingerprints, and we're going to find the first ridge count of the first loop. So we're going to find the first loop. So we're going to look at finger number 1, finger number 2, finger number 3. So the first one of those, it's a loop. the key is going to be the ridge count of that loop. The only difference, though, is if the first print is a pinky, we're not going to use that as the key. So we can't use one of the pinkies as the key. So if our first loop is a pinky, then we're going to skip it and go to the next one and use the ridge count of the next one. So looking at this fingerprint, it's been blocked out. We have all of our individual fingerprint classifications here. So the key is going to be the one here to the left of the major. In this case, it's 19. Why is it 19? Because we're going to look for the first loop. All right, so we can see here's an ulnar loop. So we can see its ridge count is 19. So we're going to look for the very first loop in our fingerprints, and its ridge count is 19. So we're just going to put the 19 up here to those. So that's the key. So that's what we do with that. Here's another set of fingerprints. Again, what we're looking for is the first fingerprint that's a loop, and we're going to look at its ridge count. So this is a whorl, so that's not going to count. We're going to look at this one's a whorl, this one's a whorl, this one's a whorl. This one is a loop, but remember we can't use pinkies, so we're going to skip that one. So now we're going to look at this one. It's a whorl, this one's a whorl, this one's a whorl. All right, now we have a loop. It's not a pinky, so we can see its ridge count is 5, so we write a 5 here in the spot for the key. So that's what we do there. Again, we don't include the pinkies for our key. All right, let's look at this card here. So we're looking for the first loop, and then we're going to use its ridge count. But if you notice, every one of these fingerprints is a whorl, so obviously none of these have a ridge count. So in that case, if you notice here, there is no key. So we do not have a key if we do not have a loop with a ridge count. We also don't have a key if the first loop, if the only loop is one of the pinkies. So that's the other thing too. So key is pretty easy. It's simply the first ridge count of the first loop as long as it's not one of the pinkies. All right, last step. The last part of the Henry classification is called the final. The final in our classification is written to the right of the subsecondary, so it goes on the far right of our classification. The final is going to be the ridge count of the right little finger if it's a loop. Now, if the right little finger is not a loop, so if it's a whorl or if it's an arch, then what we look at is the left little finger, and we use the ridge count of the left little finger if it's a loop. But if neither of the little fingers is a loop, then there is no final. So we're looking to see, we're basically just looking at the pinkies. So the majors deal with the thumbs. The pinkies are the final. So let's look at a fingerprint card here. So again, what we're looking at is we're looking at the ridge count. If the pinky is a loop, we see in this particular count it is an ulnar loop, so we have a 12, so we simply write a 12. Now, so our key is just going to be 12. Now, if we're using the right little finger, then we write the 12 in the numerator. But what if this was not a loop? What if this was an arch? Then we'd look at the left little finger. And if we use the left little finger, then we would write the number in the denominator. So, for example, looking at this card, all right, the first thing we look at is the right little finger, but in this case it's a whorl, so we're not going to use this one. So now we look at the left little finger. It is a loop, has a ridge count of 12, but this time we don't write it in the numerator spot, we write it in the denominator spot. All right, what if neither one of the two fingerprints is a loop? So what if neither the right pinky or the left pinky is a loop? Well, then you notice here that we simply have no key. Well, folks, that's it. We've gone through all 6 steps on how to do a Henry system classification. We went through how to do a primary. Remember, the primary deals with which of the fingerprints are whorls. So if we're looking at this card here, we'd look at which of the fingerprints are whorls, and we would total up the values first of the even number fingers with whorls, and then we put that in the numerator, and then we would total up the values of the odd number fingers that have whorls. We'd look at 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, and then we put that number in the denominator. The next thing we do is we look at the secondary, so primaries first, secondaries first. Remember, with the secondary, we're looking at the index fingers, and all we're going to do is we're going to write the tracing. Sorry, no, we're not the tracing. I'm sorry. We're going to write the capital letter underneath the 2 index fingers. So we can see here is our secondary. We have a capital W because this one's a whorl, and a capital R because this one is a radial loop. The next thing we do is we look at subsecondary. Remember, with subsecondary, one of the first things we want to look at is, are there any small letters to the right of our index fingers? Because if there are, then we don't have a subsecondary. So if we look here, we can see right away that there is a a small letter, so we have a plain arch here to the right of this index finger, so there is no subsecondary. What we do though is we indicate its location with some dashes, so we know that this plain arch is in the pinky finger because we know it's 3 fingers away from our index finger, which is a whorl. After we do our subsecondary, the next thing we do is our major. Remember, major deals with our thumbs. So if we look at our thumbs here, remember the major goes here to the left of the primary. If they're whorls, which both of these are whorls, all we do is bring up the tracing. So we put an O because we have an outer tracing here, and an O because we have an outer tracing here. So that's how we do our major. The next thing we do is our key. Remember, the key is the first loop, the ridge count of the first loop. So we go along here looking for the first loop. Here's our first loop. So we'll bring our ridge count of 8. We put it up here just to the left of our major. And then the last thing we do is we look at our final. Remember, our final is the ridge count of a loop in the pinkies. Well, since we don't have any loops in the pinkies, then we don't have a final. So we can see that's the steps we go through to complete this Henry. Now, what is this Henry used for? The Henry then is used to help us to file this fingerprint card in a way that we can look for, we can put it with other fingerprint cards that have the same sort of physiological characteristics to the print. So for example, we're going to look at putting all the cards that have the same primaries together. So we're going to find all the cards that have the same primary 3018 together. And then once we put all those together, then we're going to start looking at ordering them based upon the secondary. And then after that, we're going to order them based upon the subsecondary. So we use these numbers to file the cards in a particular order. So going back to our initial situation, if you remember, I explained a scenario where we found a dead body, and we didn't know who that person was. So when that body went to the ME's office, we fingerprinted it, and then we're hoping to look and find a set of fingerprints in our files that might match those fingerprints. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a Henry classification on the fingerprints from our deceased individual, and then we're going to go to our files and we're going to find other fingerprint cards in our files that have the same Henry, and then we're going to go ahead and do a comparison between the two sets of fingerprints to see if they match. So you can see the value of the Henry system.